Welcome to Talking Tuesdays. I am your host, Fancy Quant, and today we're going to talk about coping with failure. So I hope you guys have realized now we're deep into this, podcast season on, down to business here. And I hope you realize this business that we ran, we operated, it lasted for many years. I worked there for 8 years. I stepped away, tried to separate myself as much as possible towards the end. Again, still providing support here and there as needed, more or less from a family perspective, but the business failed, right? There's no other way of saying it. And you can look at some of the positives, things we've done, customers we've impacted, right? There are customers that bought product, they loved it. It was better than what was available on the market. Some customers got amazing service from us. Other ones did not, just because we ran out of resources and we failed in many ways. But one of the key takeaways, I think, from running a business and bankrupting it in general is kind of just coping with the failures as a general concept, right? If you fail at something in life and you don't actually take something away from it, you don't learn why you failed, then I think you're truly a failure, right? But if you actually fail in life, it's good. It's a good thing many times, right? You can learn from it. It's a great experience to kind of better yourself. I find out if you fail at something so bad and then you kind of learn your mistakes from it, you often carry those lessons with you much deeper down inside your core of who you are as a person versus, somebody telling you, hey, do it this way because it's better, and then you just kind of trusting it. But again, learning from your failures is going to be crucial, okay? Stepping away from a business, for example, and a failed venture is extremely hard. It is extremely hard to file the bankruptcy paperwork. So Chapter 7, so Chapter 11 is restructuring. That's not an option unless you're trying to keep it going. Chapter 7 is where you put the final nail in the coffin. It is done. But it's hard coping with these things. And so I want to just kind of reflect back on some of these aspects of this, right? One being you're always going to have that what if kind of moment or mentality thinking back over it, right? I was there for 8 years. The business, I think, went on for 12, 13 years, something before it kind of died out. It was 10 years, 12 years, but then it essentially just died out and was inoperable for many years before bankruptcy paperwork started the filing process. But looking back and thinking to yourself, what if I would have managed differently, for example, right? So we talked about in the management segment, trying to set rules and standards. And if I would have, you think about what if I would have dropped out of college and just went full time and managed, right? I was the most profitable operations manager if you stuck with it for a long time, right? Senior management didn't want me to do it remotely. And so if you could stick with it and you could have just done it full time, would that have saved the business? Right? I don't know. Looking back as well on your failures, it's important to realize you're not the greatest, right? There was a lot of things I was not great at. Management side of it, I did fairly well. Clearly I did better than everybody else that we had in that position, at least, due to profitability metrics. But at the end of the day, how do you really cope with that? How do you go through these what if scenarios? I think it is important to go back and kind of think them through a little bit, right? You're never going to know the full answer of if I would have done this differently, this would have been the outcome. And one of the big takeaways too from, failing businesses, for example, is there are always 100 problems. It's not like you have a problem and if you would have fixed the one problem, it would have fixed everything. Or at least it's pretty rare to have one significant problem. A lot of times with startups, you have a lot of key problems here. And one of the biggest problems we always had was that we had too few of staff, and so we were always spread way too thin. And I kind of mentioned this in a few other videos. If we would have had more people, right, I could have focused, for example, more on marketing and analytics, done a lot better job on that, right? Again, I didn't have the educational background at the time, layering on all this education over the years through the venture itself. Looking back, it's easy to say, okay, I could have built models to predict X, Y, and Z, and we could have edged out competition because I know for a fact our competitors aren't doing it. But again, I didn't have that at the time, so it's not a feasible thing. But again, if we would have been able to bring in better talent, we would have been able to find good accountants, for example. Finding good accountants it's impossible. It's hard to find, especially finding someone who understands manufacturing accounting. It is far more complex than most other sorts of accounting because there's just so much more tracking that goes on with inventory, cost of goods sold, right, in production, stuff like that. So work in progress, we call it the WIP. But anyways, looking back on that, trying to diagnose a lot of these problems, trying to kind of take out as many lessons as possible from your failures is going to be a very important aspect and piece here. It's just challenging, okay? It's challenging to cope with it. It's challenging to accept it. But I think if you can extract those pieces of knowledge, you can learn from it as best as possible. Try to connect the dots on the failure and why it failed. It's easier to let go, and you actually gained a lot from it. Now, that being said, a lot of successful businessmen, so if you look out there at a lot of them, they start businesses, they run them, they realize they're not profitable, they realize it's not a good idea, and then they close them down fairly quickly, and then they move on to something else, right? Or maybe they try to start a second version of it, but basically they restart with new investors, so they have fresh capital, fresh ideas. They might pull some people from the old business, bring in some new people, right? Mix things up and try it again. That is a really smart idea. I don't think a lot of people realize that. And it's really hard when your personal money is tied up in a business. So again, my family owned a big portion of this venture here. So it was really hard to step away from the project. Even when it's not your money, when it's family's money and it's all kind of tied together, it is really hard to close it down early and say, hey, like we're not making that much money or it's not doing so well, let's just close it down. And we've taken on say a 50% loss or something up front, and then everyone moves on. It's really challenging to do that. And that leads me to kind of the final discussion point here, which is there are not enough people that learn from failure. So doing a startup, failing it, going through the headaches. So yes, it has had financial impacts rippling through our lives far beyond the business itself. So it is not like I'm taking this lightly. But I think it is very important for people to run businesses who want to do it and really learn from these failures, learn from these disasters. I think it's a big, crucial impact on creating better, well-rounded business people. So one giant criticism I have for these big Fortune 500 companies is often a lot of them have gone through like the typical corporate route where you go in, you went to college, got a 4-year degree, got a business degree, right? Maybe you got an MBA, and then you work in these very structured corporations where there's no chaos. You don't see the full picture, even though you think you do. And eventually you become a CEO or a CFO or whatever, and you think you understand how things work. You don't understand how anything works, to be honest with you. There's so much layering, so much structure, so much design all put into this, so many safety nets, right? Whole departments you're never going to really understand or work with, that you just lack that full understanding. And doing that as a small business, I think, is crucial. So if you want to do a startup, right, doing it when you're younger is probably a better idea than when you're older. But again, if you fail, you will learn a ton from it. And I don't think a lot of people these days really value failure as much as they should. Right? There's so many people that are excited to be winners, and right, everybody nowadays is just patting kids on the back, telling them, you're great, you're wonderful, right? Here's a participation trophy. No worries, you came in last place. And I think this is detrimental because people aren't adapted to failure. Okay? And you need to realize that when you start getting into the business world and free markets here, so we failed, it had massive financial impacts on us. I am still a huge fan of capitalism, free markets, right? The market's going to pick those that are the most efficient. So again, it's going to provide the best allocation of assets for investors. So again, investors are going to place money in ventures that seem more profitable or better ideas. There's a million ideas out there, but allocating assets and resources to those, it has to be done by the individual. It has to be done by capitalism and free markets deciding based on individuals' rights and freedoms. And then also, right, the market picks winners and losers. So in our case, we had an amazing product. We just could never make it on time and on budget. That was like the biggest struggle possible. So we had this amazing design, and if it was built correctly, people absolutely loved it. They'd rant and rave and say, this is 10 times better than the competitors. We love it. We want to order, 5 more. And they would get these ordered for 5 more, and they'd be behind schedule. And then, sometimes the quality wasn't so great, and we'd finally ship stuff and get it out, and they weren't so happy. And then we'd have to go back and fix it all and repair it. And they'd go, okay, I liked the product. I didn't like the timing. I didn't like that it had to get repaired, 10, 15 times. But the final product was great and wonderful. We love it. I don't know if we're going to order again. And so we always had this kind of struggle, back and forth. But having that capital market to really come in and just kind of weed us out is hard to accept. But often it's easy to look at it and say, okay, there were pieces of the puzzle we just couldn't put together, right? We couldn't buy parts, manufacture it, and sell it at a competitive enough price in the market based on the cost that it cost us to do it. So again, right, trying to accept responsibility here. We're not seeing a lot of this these days. If you can learn to fail, get up, pick yourself back up. And I think everyone in the business for the most part has, had some down times. It's hard to cope with it. Investors lost a lot of money. Presidents, executives, or whatever, people involved, senior management, myself included. It's really hard to kind of accept it and then, glean all those lessons from the experience and then kind of pick yourself back up and say, okay, it's fine. We're going to move on and do something different here. So for me here, right, I saw the chaos, the turmoil. I was involved. There were a lot of parts of it that I absolutely loved. But being able to switch gears for me mentally, I think was a lot more beneficial, as some people have not been able to do that as easily, right? You're so tied into an industry or a group, it's hard to shift gears out of that and do something different. Often when you fail at these startups, you have to realize people might not hire you because you're kind of deemed as a failure, but also you have the perfect skill set to really make things happen and solve problems with their businesses. So again, learning from those failures, trying to cope with it, trying to realize there are real winners and real losers in the world. And just because you lose or you fail, or you didn't do well, you need to take this opportunity to gain from this, failure and learn as much as possible instead of kind of pitying yourself and just sitting down on your luck thinking like life sucks and somehow you need to make this fair. So anyways, those are kind of my takeaways here on coping with failure. Again, you're going to reflect back on it. Don't beat yourself up too much, but on the positive flip side of this, you need to learn as much as possible from these failures for them to be advantageous for you. If you don't do that, again, a failure is a failure and there's nothing you're going to learn from it. You're in a bad situation just in general. So try to learn from your mistakes, try to build on top of that, use that experience. I can tell you, I have used a lot of what I've learned in my startup experience on managing up the chain and managing down the chain of my professional career. It's one of the key components that makes me a little bit more robust, more active, and I work so much better with business departments. A lot of times I work with accounting, or not accounting, well sometimes accounting areas, but a lot of times like operations and other teams that are actually using models. Having that robustness and that skill, seeing their perspective, seeing what HR actually does at a firm, it gives me that well-rounded experience to kind of learn and manage things from the top. So anyways, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, until next time.